Okay. Hey, Sharon, good to see you. Oh, I can hardly keep up with the feed on all of this. Viv, thanks for coming back. Yeah, this is terrific. Ha ha ha. Lots of names. Julia, Lesage, really appreciate it. Georgina Klee, great to have you here as well. Cheryl, thanks for coming. Chris, this is just a fantastic lineup of people. Just wonderful. Wow. More and more and more people than I know. More people than maybe some of you know. It's always a good sign when there are strangers. Always a good sign. Girish, thanks so much for coming. Terrific. Yeah, this is really fun. I think this might be my favorite part of doing webinars. Yeah. Come on in. Thanks. We're already up to 75 people here in the room and counting. Since we had over 200 sign up, I expect people will be coming in. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. All right. Let's get started. Let's get this show on the road. I am B. Ruby Rich. I am the editor of Film Quarterly Journal, published by University of California Press and supported by the Ford Foundation Just Films, so that we can do webinars like this and special issues like this dossier on the new disability media with its special accessible website. Happy to be here. This is in our series of webinars. I just want to let everyone know that it will live on forever as long as the platforms last. When today is over, in about a week, this will be showing up on the Film Quarterly webinar. You can direct people there, you can revisit it, you can share it and use it in teaching. And we're very proud to be here with this stellar group of panelists. I am here co-hosting with co-editors Faye Ginsberg and Lawrence Carter Long. You'll be hearing from them imminently. Let me introduce myself. B. Ruby Rich. I am an older woman in glasses with short dark hair, sitting in a sparsely furnished Paris apartment, welcoming you to all that follows. I am going to begin with our very first pair of speakers, the scholar Arseli Dokumaci, who wrote on Rodney Evans' vision portraits. Rodney Evans, our poster child, I should say, on the cover of this special issue. And let me turn this over now
Ruby?
to Arseli and Rodney. Yes, Faye?
Ruby, Mish is just going to make a quick
I'm so sorry. Yes, let me,
comment.
Sorry, Mish, go ahead. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Mish, please.
Yeah.
No worries. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Mish, and I'll be doing accessibility for this event. I have white skin, big brown curly hair, a lip piercing, and black overalls on. I'm sitting at the desk in my room. So just a few access notes before we begin. I'd like to remind our panelists to self-describe and to please speak one at a time at a pace that is easy for our interpreters to follow. We're pleased to offer CART and ASL today. And big thank you to our access workers. Please toggle captions on or off by going to the bottom navigation panel and clicking on closed captioning. The interpreters are showing in gallery view, and there shouldn't be a need to pin them. However, there may be issues with viewing the interpreters and captions simultaneously. If you experience this on a desktop, you may drag the captions anywhere on the screen by clicking and dragging the caption box. You can also adjust the font size of the captions in the settings. As mentioned on the event publicity, we do not recommend using a phone or tablet to access this webinar if you need ASL and CART simultaneously. Please message me if you have any access needs that aren't being met today, and we'll try to come up with a solution. If the Zoom chat isn't accessible for you, you can text or call me at 908-938-1032. Again, that's 908-938-1032. I'll be turning my screen off, but we'll be here for the duration of the event. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mish. Sorry about that. And for everyone, the text that Mish just read is also in the chat if you need to consult it for her phone number or for any details. So over to you, Rodney and Arseli.
Hi, which one of us you want to go first, Ruby?
As you like. Doesn't matter to me. Suit yourselves.
Go ahead, Arseli.
Rodney. Go. Hi, Rodney. So nice to see you.
Likewise.
You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a brown-skinned Black man with short brown hair with twists on the top, and I'm wearing a black and blue patterned shirt against a white wall in my kitchen in the land of the Lenape people, also known as Flatbush, Brooklyn. And I am the director of Vision Portraits, and I teach film production and screenwriting at Swarthmore College.
Thank you, Rodney. This is Arseli speaking. I'm so happy to be in the same screen with you. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Ruby, Faye, and the entire FQ team and the Access team for making this event happen. I'm an olive-skinned woman in her early 40s, short black hair. I'm accompanied by my plants, and I also have a pile of books behind me, a little bit of self-promotion. It took me 10 years to write. It's my book. I'm very proud, and it's called Activist Affordances. Thank you, Faye. Big heart to you for reading it. And I'm joining you today from Jojage, also known as Montreal. And I'm, as an immigrant settler, I'm grateful to the Ganyanga Haga Nation for taking care of the lands and waters that keep me, sustain me, and keep me alive every day. And I would like to begin first by being again thrilled to be here with all the people whose works I admire. And I'm going to start with a prompt, a little bit of an introduction, and then pass it on to Rodney, and then we will engage in this organic conversation until the point where Ruby will stop us saying, that's enough, 10 minutes. Okay, so I begin with a quote, and the quote is from late disability artist, writer Neil Marcus. And Neil Marcus has famously said, disability is an art and ingenious way to live. And why do disabled people have to be ingenious? Well, because we live in an ableist world. And if you want to survive in that world, you have no option but to be a little bit inventive. For example, if light switches are too high for you to reach from your wheelchair, you might just want to use your head to turn them on and off instead of your arms. To give another example, this time from Vision Portraits, as a blind photographer, you might ask your assistants, as John Dugdale does, to become your hands and your eyes in order to be able to use a device, the camera, that never ever thought of you as its user in the first place. So in my work, I'm interested in these everyday tricks, so to say. Disabled people are improvising in order to make things work against all odds. And I'm fascinated by these very subtle, tiny tricks, these acts of resistance, if you will, and something that I'm calling activist affordances, which allows disabled people to survive and even to thrive in the most hostile of environments. Now we know that the film industry is one of those environments. From ableist actor training techniques, which Carrie Sandahl brilliantly exposes in her classic essay, The Trinity of Neutral, to the discriminatory infrastructures of film production sets. There's a plethora of explicit and implicit barriers and casual ableism. Now I want to turn to Rodney and ask, as a low vision filmmaker, do you have any creative tricks that help you circumvent or at least mitigate the effects of these barriers and casual ableism? And how do you skillfully survive and continue to make art in and thrive, to use your own words, in one of the most ableist and homophobic industries in the world? Please share us your disability cheat sheets. Thank you. I pass it on to you, Rodney.
Thank you so much, Arseli, and everyone who put this event together. First, for asking me, and Arseli, for the very provocative question. I don't know if I would say there's so much at cheats as they are being very transparent about my disability and just showing up fully as my Black, queer, disabled self. You know what I mean? And so that means in introductory meetings, really explaining what retinitis pigmentosa is, what the limitations are around my vision. So having tunnel vision and you know, all of the misunderstandings and misperceptions that can be construed. You know, I will give examples of things like, you know, if you're handing me a call sheet and it looks like I'm not seeing the call sheet, I'm probably not seeing the call sheet. So you can just say, hey, Rodney, here's a call sheet for tomorrow. You know, things like that, where and then I'm also advocating for myself, you know, in terms of fiction films. I'm also asking the crew to give me a clear and unencumbered path to the actors. So, you know, a lot of times I describe retinitis pigmentosa, you know, which is like tunnel vision. It's basically, you know, I have no peripheral vision and, you know, I can't really see below my chest so much and too high above my head. So, you know, I would just say that it allows me to really focus on the performances of the actors, which is the job of the director, right? You know, so I will carefully compose the shot, and then I will focus on the emotions and the chemistry between the actors. I will delegate to my crew, and I will empower the crew to let me know if something was out of focus, if there was a bump, you know, in the move of the shot, if the, you know, the boom dipped into the shot at a certain point, if there was mic hiss, even though I'm wearing headphones, maybe there's something that the sound mixer is hearing that I'm not hearing. So I'm giving them the power to call it out and say, hey, that didn't go so well, Rodney. We need to go again. I know it was the most brilliant performance that you loved so much, but on a technical, by, you know, technical standards, I think it's best for us to go again. So I'm empowering people, and that way I'm relieving myself of the duty of having to deal with the chaos of the set. It's like, okay, I do see the halo of light over the actress's head, and I'm not happy with that, but I can, you know, tell the DP that, and then the gaffers and the electricians can work on that, and then I can keep my focus on the directing and on the performances, which is ultimately why people come to the movies. It's like, did you care? Were you involved with the relationships and the characters? And I'm the only person that's responsible for that. So that lies on me, and it allows me to really take that really, really seriously. And so, you know, I would say that, you know, another thing that I was interested in terms of just of vision portraits and in documentary was this idea of intra-community dialogue, right? And the fact that we were all blind or low vision, and that there were certain physical bodily experiences that we had all gone through at a certain point or were about to go through. So we could, you know, in the case of Kayla and I, we identify as low vision. John and Ryan Knighton identify as blind. So, you know, they could tell us things further along the journey. So really just having that really embedded trust in a kind of dialogue, because you're making yourself as vulnerable as the participants are, and they know that and they feel that. So, you know, on a lot of occasions, I've done panels with Kayla Hamilton, the dancer and the choreographer in the film, and she basically says straight up, like, I wouldn't have been in this film if Rodney wasn't directing it. You know what I mean? So it really comes down to that kind of fundamental trust, that real embodied sense memory of what an experience was, and that they know that you understand that there is no translation that needs to happen. And all of those things I found were really important in vision portraits, and sort of you know, building the foundation of trust that went into that project. So
Thanks for that. Yeah, Rodney. Arseli, unfortunately, your first question is also your last question, because we're through the 10 minutes. But did you want to just add something before we move on to the next? I want to give you a wrap-up chance.
I have too many questions, so I will give the floor to someone else. But I would love to continue this conversation with Rodney in another format somewhere, because everything you said was so rich, Rodney. I already have things like waiting there to be asked. So
well, you know, we have another section of this coming up. So we'll hear from you again. There'll be more time to speak. And I just want to assure the audience of that as well. We just do these quick introductions, and then we kind of dig in, and then we get to your questions. So good, very good. Don't worry. Okay. I want to turn the floor, as it were, over to Jenny Chamarette, who's joining us from the UK, and my co-editor, Lawrence Carter-Long, who's going to be chatting with her about her work on the Steve Dwoskin archives. And I think there you are. Great. So welcome, Jenny. Lawrence, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruby. Pleasure to be here with you again, and pleasure to be here with Jenny. I'd like to start out, Jenny, as you relate in your fantastic piece, Backdating the Crip Technoscience Manifesto, Steve Dwoskin's digital activism. Dwoskin is not an easy guy to categorize, right? He's a disabled polymath, as you write, and he had left a flourishing career in graphic design in New York for a Fulbright fellowship that led to a filmmaking career in London's underground culture in the 60s. That's a unique petri dish of influences that don't easily translate to what we'd colloquially consider commercial. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious to know, I had to search I didn't find out about Dwoskin until the time that he passed. So I'm searching underground archives and connecting with film nerds on the internet and trying to find his work as best I could, given the resources that were available to me here in the States. How did you first learn about Steve Dwoskin?
Before I answer that, Lawrence, did you just want to describe yourself briefly?
Oh, yes. See, I'm so excited to have this conversation. Forgot the visual description. So sorry. Thank you for the reminder. I'm a middle-aged white man with short cropped hair, a floral shirt, and a blue jacket. There we go. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. So this is Jenny speaking. I am a light-skinned woman in my early 40s. I'm wearing a dark green shirt and jumper, and behind me is a whole stack of books. I'm in my studio. Yeah, really good questions. Good question, Lawrence. I mean, how did I come to his work? How did I hear about his work? How does his work get visibility? I think this is a particularly important question for the Disability Film Archive, for how we tell the stories of disability film history. And I feel Steve Dwoskin is a particularly important figure in that emerging canon, in that new history of film that the New Disability Media special issue is all about. I actually came to Steve Dwoskin's work through my colleague Rachel Garfield, who I believe is in the audience tonight. So hi, Rachel. Rachel was a friend, colleague, mentored by Steve, and in 2012, when he very sadly passed away, she became the executor to his estate. And as part of this, Rachel was based at the University of Reading, where I'm based now. And Steve was an incredible collector, you might say hoarder. And he kept everything across his entire career, which, you know, in terms of his filmmaking that we're talking about, what started in the 1960s, in terms of his graphic design, we're talking about earlier, his writing, his photography. So there was a huge amount of material ready to be cared for. And so Rachel was absolutely crucial in bringing the archive, bringing the material that then was to become the Dwoskin archive. And it's as a result of that project, which we got UK Research Council funding for, that we then started this kind of epic journey of building a picture of what a life's work looks like, what a life's work of filmmaking looks like. So my kind of journey of access towards Dwoskin was really through Rachel, because she'd heard about my work on embodiment and complex embodiment and disability and gender. So I came to Dwoskin kind of through this, through again a network of connections, and I think that network of connections and community is kind of vital for, I think, how we learn, how we start to build that broader archival history of what disability filmmaking looks like. But I wanted to ask the same question to you, Lawrence, about how you came to learn about Dwoskin.
I'm a little more Tarantino than I am, Ingmar Bergman, right? I'm a nerd about this stuff, and so as I sort of did my deeper dives into disability film, Dwoskin was a name that popped up and kept popping up, and was very provocative in terms of the work. And that kindled the archivist, the armchair archivist in me, who then had to hunt down some of his work and see what he was about and figure out what the buzz was about, and just, sort of the unique place that I think he holds, right? So it was really sort of kindling. That seemed to be such a central figure, as you mentioned, a unique figure, that I was a little ticked off that I hadn't had an opportunity to see his work, right? And so I started to hunt that down and started to get very dogged about that. You mentioned, and we both talk about sort of the unique place that he holds, and it's even amazing that we can talk about archives in the context of disabled filmmakers. That's a relatively new possibility, right? And so I'd like to know, why, in your opinion, does Dwoskin matter? I mean, I mentioned him in the manifesto, the Disability Film Manifesto that I wrote for Film Quarterly back in 2019. Why does Dwoskin hold this place with regard to new disability media and contemporary filmmakers? And what are the strong resonances or echoes that you might feel there?
I was so excited when I saw your manifesto in that 2019 Film Quarterly Manifestos issue, because you said in the title, "Where have you gone, Stephen Dwoskin?" And I was thinking, and the rest of the team were thinking, he's over here. He's here in the UK, like he's here, he's waiting. Like there's a host of people who are so excited to find new audiences for his work. And I mean, in terms of resonances, so one of the areas I've been working on in the archive in the films is to do with thinking about sexuality and gender. And I'm really interested in what happens when CRIP and disabled filmmaking starts to queer gender. And he made a lot of complex, quite challenging films. a lot of which were about, especially the early films, a lot of them were about vulnerability, about female vulnerability as well. And there's something really interesting that goes on with the way that his camera, which held, whether he was standing using calipers, who's a childhood survivor of polio, so whether he was standing, using calipers and crutches, or whether he was lying down, there's something about the intimacy and the vulnerability of his filmmaking that has a deeply embodied and phenomenological quality. And he also made work from wherever he was. And I think that adaptive quality, it resonates so much with what Arseli was saying, with Rodney talking about adaptive community practices. And it also resonated quite powerfully for me with Kelly Fritsch and Amy Hamray's Crypt Technoscience Manifesto, which appeared in Catalyst Journal a couple of years back. And I was especially interested in what Dworkin did as digital filmmaking was evolving in the 1990s. He was really one of the first to start using, for example, Hi8 videotape or DV tapes to start exploring what capacity digital video kind of had for him as a filmmaker who was experiencing his own transitions in his health conditions, in his lived experience of impairment, in his use of a chair. And so there's that crypt technoscience kind of in the making. That's what I see in Dworkin's work. And I think that's one of the connecting values, that if we're looking for a disability media history, an activist media history, then Dworkin is one of those people who's got a key role in that. And especially for Film Quarterly, the transatlantic relationship between Brooklyn, where he was born, and London, where he spent most of his life, and then the rest of Europe, where he was really well received in France and Germany, for example. I feel like that global mobility is also part of his work. And that's also what makes him a really important figure, and really exciting for the new generation of sort of new disability media, in how connected that longer history of practice is, regardless of whether it's known or intentional or not. I can feel those resonances, and yeah, that really excites me.
Let me just jump in here because we're unfortunately at the 10-minute mark. But I just want to brief you two for when we go to our next section of conversation, that we've had a request for you to at least talk a little bit about what his films are like. What are they about? That's been a question from Suzanne Helmuth here in the chat. So keep that in mind when we gave you some more time coming up soon, that might be something to encapsulate for people who don't know this amazing work of his. Okay? Sorry to cut you off, but I'm going to go. You get to stay on screen, Lawrence, because we're pulling you in again to speak with Salome Chasnoff and Carrie Sandahl about the film Code of the Freaks. Salome is the director of Code of the Freaks. Carrie is a co-writer and participant in Code of the Freaks. And unfortunately, we do not have Slava Greenberg with us today, who wrote this wonderful article about the film, because he's been a victim of air travel disruption on the West Coast due to these storms. So climate change got him, but we've got Lawrence here, who also appears in Code of the Freaks. So we're putting you on double duty, Lawrence, and I'm going to turn the time over to the three of you. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I have great affection for Code of the Freaks and was honored to be a part of it. Why don't you start? I think Salome, you had some opening comments, and then Carrie was going to talk a bit. Then I'll follow up with some questions.
Thank you, Ruby and Lawrence. As mentioned, my name is Salome Chasnoff, she, they. I'm the Code of the Freaks director. And thanks so much to Film Quarterly for bringing this conversation together. I'm an older white woman with medium length, dark hair that's completely white in the front. And I'm wearing black glasses that I keep taking on and off to be able to read the chat because I have a vision impairment. And I'm wearing a black and white top. I'm sitting in front of a zebra mural, and the zebras are also wearing black and white. I'm speaking from my house in Chicago, which is the traditional homeland of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa nations, Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox also called this area home. Located at the intersection of several great waterways, the land naturally became a site of travel and healing for many nations. And today, Chicago is home to the 6th largest urban Native community in the so-called United States. I'd like to open the discussion with a brief origin story of the film that also recognizes the pivotal role of Susan Nussbaum, a co-writer and co-producer who tragically passed away last spring. Making Code of the Freaks was Susan's idea. Susan often recalled her experience of becoming disabled in her early 20s and knowing nothing about disability except what she'd seen in the movies, filled with characters choosing to die rather than live with a disability. As Susan would say, God forbid. So the future she envisioned for herself at this point in her life was very bleak. When she became involved in the disability rights movement shortly thereafter, her life radically changed, and she could finally see through the toxic messaging in these representations of disability being churned out by Hollywood. In the early 2000s, Susan and I began making a series of short documentaries with the Empowered Fifis, a support and advocacy group for girls that Susan started at Access Living in Chicago. The girls had multiple disabilities, and the possibility of making movies was completely foreign to them. The experience, which took place over 4 or 5 years, was transformational for all of us. And this is where the insider POV, the insider perspective that Slava so brilliantly lays out in his article, was shaped. The girls were in total control of their narratives about growing up disabled. During this time, and recalling her own experience of becoming disabled, Susan started talking about making a documentary that would expose the ways mainstream cinema exploits disabled characters for the benefit of the non-disabled protagonists and audiences. So we began by putting together movie clips on particular themes, blind men and women, magical creatures, and so on. Many of these themes you see in Code of the Freaks. And we screened these montages at salons with audience discussions, and we filmed the discussions. And the first one took place at Access Living. And based on the enthusiastic responses we were getting from a range of audiences, disabled and non-disabled, we decided to go ahead with Susan's documentary idea. We were clear from the beginning that this was to be a conversation essentially by and for Crips. And we called upon people from within the community to think about the dilemma of the disabled body on screen. And with that, I will turn it over to my beloved Carrie Sandahl.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and so happy to be here. And I'm so appreciative of Slava for his article. I think that we decided that he's our ideal spectator. We really enjoyed his take on the film. I am a white woman in her middle age. I'm wearing glasses and I'm sitting in my home office in Oak Park, Illinois. To add on to Salome's origin story, I became involved with Code of the Freaks in, was it 2009 or 2010? I came to the University of Illinois at Chicago from Florida State University, where I was a professor of theater and performance studies. And my background is in theater and performance as a dramaturg, director, and actor. And when I came to UIC to teach in disability studies, I inherited a class called Disability in American Film. And there's so much overlap between what happens in film narrative and happens in theater. I, with gusto, took on the class. And I had been a super fan of Susan Nussbaum for a number of years. I'm a disabled woman, using my wheelchair back there. And when I was in graduate school and an undergraduate, I had no role models of disabled people in the theater. I didn't know anyone. I didn't see anyone. Susan became known to me by one of my mentors at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I went to graduate school. And I did the thing where I just cold called her, introduced myself. I lurked around her. So I was really excited when I moved to Chicago and became one of her friends in her tight friend circle. And she and Salome invited me to lunch and told me about the film. And it sounded perfect. It sounded like a project I was so thrilled to be part of because of that insider perspective. And as someone who, had trained as a theater artist, but then learned that my options were few. And that another thing I learned very early on, which I think informs the project significantly, is that whenever disability appears in representation, whether theater or film or anywhere, it has meaning. It doesn't just appear, it serves a purpose to the plot. It furthers the narrative in some way. And I felt that very viscerally as a young actor trying to get cast, or the way I was directed. So that kind of had launched me in exploring disability representation. So this was a way that not only could I do this, I'd been very isolated. It's like an only. And to be in community with Salome and Susan and the wider disability community in Chicago in making this was just a way for us to talk back and to, band together. I call this film our representational retribution to Hollywood. And it was just a joy and pleasure to be in that community of makers.
And I think as Slava so brilliantly points out in his piece, that one of the things that's really unique is you've got 13 disability activists, artists, scholars, right, responding to hundreds of clips, with all the stereotypes, and everybody's giving their feedback and their responses to that, which are snarky and in your face and sort of unapologetic. I wonder if you'd talk about the tone of the film and why you felt compelled to deviate so much from how these films are generally done.
Okay, I can pick that up. The little gap makes me think I could pick that up. I will say that we did have a pushback from funders when we were looking for money, because people they wanted something that was kind of more general audience agreeable, and they didn't like the tone and the insider perspective. But it was very important to us because, I mean, for one thing, it's who we are. We're all snarky kind of people, and we, our humor. I mean, I will say making Code of the Freaks, because we all had full-time jobs, was a 10, 12-year period. It was really a mini lifetime within a larger lifetime. And so, by the middle of this process, we had become one mind. And we were probably all cloning Susan, I'm guessing. But so it was just kind of, it was really important to us not to whitewash the experience of being represented this way, and of being sitting in an audience where these films were being watched.
Yeah, and I'll just add to it that I think it was tough at times, and we still receive pushback at screenings. There's kind of a demand for us not only to point out the way that disability is used as a narrative device, as kind of a a way to inspire non-disabled people to better themselves in some way. And that's our basic argument for the film. And people want us not only to have identified that, but also to fix the problem within the movie. It's like, I think if it was that easy, we would have done that already. But, you know, throughout the film, we are very snarky, and that's also part of a disability or CRIP survival strategy, how to survive in a hostile world. And it's, you know, it's our perspective. But also, you know, we were really wanting to make sure that we weren't just panning everything, because that's easy to do. You know, stereotypes bad. Here they are. They all suck. We can all go home now. But we didn't want to do that. Throughout the film, many of the interviewees talked about moments. So we decided, like, focus on these moments that have potential, these moments where something new could happen, something different could have happened, where we found some hope. So while there was like the overall tone of snark, it was like also it wasn't. I feel like it was it was done in camaraderie. It was done kind of with love, because we watched so many movies. If we didn't in some way enjoy the process, we wouldn't have tortured ourselves with so many movies. Yeah, so
Yeah.
loving snark, we can call it that.
Yeah, so I just tag on to that, and also to pick up on something Lawrence mentioned in your introduction. Yeah, there are hundreds of clips that cover film history, over 100 years of film history, and our interviewees, everybody doesn't agree on everything. So, you know, there's a range of opinions, and I think it's pretty clear that within our film, we all acknowledge we grew up with these movies. They're not just a part of film history, they're a part of our personal histories. And many of these films we've seen over and over and over again. So they're representative of moments in our lives that we want to hold on to, in spite of the torture that we experience from some of these representations, or maybe because of, we don't know. But there's definitely no universal agreement within the film about anything, except that, you know, these representations are problematic and they need to be interrogated.
Great.
Yeah,
On that, you want to wrap up, Lawrence?
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things I really love about that is none of these things exist in a vacuum, and much of the snark also comes with love and affection and a wink and a nod, all at the same time. You know, many of these films were the first time that we saw anybody that was even remotely like us, you know, and so there's an affection for the films, but we're not beyond critiquing what didn't work as well. And so hopefully we can come back to talk a little bit more about that solidarity and the agency and the authority that you really put forward in Code. But I'll give it right back to Ruby now.
Great. Thanks, Lawrence. We're going to bring everybody back onto the screen now that you've heard from already. And for this section where we get to talk to each other and kind of free form comments. And I'm going to turn this over to you, Faye, because I think that you had something you wanted to read here to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Ruby. Is my audio okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. My name's Faye Ginsberg. I'm an older white woman with short dark hair and glasses, and wearing a kind of white blazer, and sitting in a hotel room in Washington. My first trip in 3 years away from New York. I am not wearing pajamas on the bottom like I have been in for so many other meetings. And ran to the Piscataway folks. And I do want to mention, before I just jump to the comments, for everyone on this Zoom, in case you don't know, one of the really brilliant things that Ruby and Rebecca Prime accomplished was to not only make this open access, to make this widely available as a special issue, but also to make it accessible. And they had a super high learning curve. And I just really want to props to you guys for doing that. And just to remind the audiences how great this is. I see many people are putting in the chat about their teaching. So please, make that available to your students, and have them like explore it and understand what it means to have an accessible issue like this, or a dossier, excuse me. So one of the things I want to do in following up from Code of the Freaks and Salome's opening comments, thank you. That was such a great discussion. All of this has been fabulous. I just have a quote that Slava used in his wonderful article. So I'm going to stand in a little bit for Slava here. And this is from the late and wonderful Susan Nussbaum. I'm just going to read it quickly. The operative word is code, in quote, not freaks, in quotes. And it means community. And when you have community and disabled people, particularly activists, really lean on each other. You have a sense that people have your back. Disabled people have your back. And in the movie Freaks, of course, you see that. I think that's just such, it just touches pretty much all the conversations we've been having here with Rodney and Arseli and Jenny and Lawrence. And I see Jenny actually put a great comment into the chat that speaks to this. And I just want to say one more thing, which is Ruby was very, very kind. During the time that we were editing this, my disabled daughter passed away. She had a long and rare chronic illness. And she found so much community in a variety of shows. She got to be on Linda Ellaby's Nick News when she was 10 to talk about her rare condition and so forth. And I just appreciate that Ruby knew that history for me and what brought me into all of this, and also how that community got created for her at a young age and how important that was. So sorry to slip into so many different topics there. So anyway, I just think that question of community that you raised, and I love Salome and Carrie both pointing out that people did not agree, because community isn't about everyone thinking the same way, but it's about the engagement with that work and all the kind of creativity that came out of that engagement. So maybe that's a good place to start. And Jenny, I don't know if you'd be comfortable just maybe speaking what you put into the chat, because I think it picks up on this so nicely.
Yes, absolutely. Jenny here. Yes, I was just, listening to Carrie and Salome and Lawrence talk about Code of the Freaks. I just felt such a strong resonance with Stephen Dwoskin's documentary, which he was commissioned by British broadcaster Channel 4 as part of their Disabling World season, and it was called Face of Our Fear. And the resonances just sound so uncanny in terms of he was also looking at those. I love the word snark. Carrie, I think maybe it was you that was, but maybe you and Salome were using that word. The kind of the snark about the stereotypes of disability representation, which do feature in the film. But he did also bring together a really incredible cast of disabled artists, performers, weightlifters, to create sketches that sit within the documentary as a sort of satirical tool against the darkness and the repetition of that kind of ongoing discourse of ableism that seems to run through so many representations in visual culture, and then accelerated in cinema. And I noticed that also that Lawrence suggested a double feature, and I couldn't imagine anything better. That would be wonderful.
Well, this is Carrie. I would suggest a triple feature, and including Rodney's film, because his film brings together disabled artists who are making representations that are unique and new and from our community. And when I'm teaching in my disability and film class, I do a lot of pairing of mainstream, but then focusing more and more on disability created work, because as even just over the course of the time we made Code of the Freaks, there's been so much more work that has come out. And when Rodney was saying that, was Kayla said to him that she wouldn't have participated in the same way if it hadn't been Rodney's film. I feel like that kind of came out in Code of the Freaks too, that there was kind of that rapport that we had already established with the interviewees.
Great. I just want to say everyone can feel free to jump in here. I'm going to read something that Linda Blackaby just pasted into the chat, that it looks as though Face of Our Fear is actually available through Kino Lorber with the DVD. So I just wanted to alert people to that. So.
Okay. I'd like to jump in just to pick up on Carrie's comment about making it a triple feature with Rodney. This is just, I admire that film so much. And one of the things I think is really powerful about it is your work at trying to create a film language that gives people a sense of the experience of low vision or blindness that you and the other protagonists experience. And so I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about, so for A, to alert people who haven't seen the film about how powerful that is, and B, if you could tell us a bit about how you developed that as a director, and how did you do that in conversation with your other protagonists, or just whatever whatever insight you can give us to that would be great.
And while he's thinking, I'm just going to say Linda Blackaby wrote back that I misunderstood her post, and it's actually Code of the Freaks that's at Kino Lorber. So sorry for the false report. Back and over to you, Rodney, and you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. And I will say, I purchased a copy of Code of the Freaks through Kino Lorber and watched it last night. Was thrilled by it. And Faye, to answer your question, the visual style of the film was developed in collaboration with the participants in the film. And I would say, a lot of funders these days, they want you to have the visual language of your film sort of like pinned down already. And for me, like I would always say, like the visual language of the film is going to come from my conversations with the participants, from what they tell me about their experiences. And so there's specific sections where I'll give you a couple of examples where John Dugdale talks about getting these like flashes of color in his eyes sometimes, and them being kind of like the aurora borealis. So one thing that Hannah, the other editor, and I did was open up my whole body of work as an archive, right? And so there were things like we would take like rolls of 16 millimeter that were like rolling out, and just like using like flares and the grain of like rolling out film that's usually like considered like detritus, you know what I mean? And just slowing that down and layering it with other abstract imagery to create these flashes of color that John experienced. And so some of that was from an earlier diary film that I did called Close to Home, but Hannah Buck, the brilliant editor, combined it with other archival footage and layered it and sort of pushed it even further so that you could really experience that. And another brief example is I talk about my specific field of vision, not seeing my fingers until here and then here. And she makes a mat that completely kind of mirrors that. And then that plays over a train scene in which I have fallen asleep. And I think that Newark Penn Station is New York Penn Station. And I wake up and I have my cane and I'm kind of trying to hustle to get off the train. And there are all of these people yelling at me and like pushing me like to go and to go faster and to move it. And I literally turn around and I say, I'm fucking blind. And I wield my cane and they're suddenly like in shame and in horror. And then sometimes you have to do that, right? You have to sort of like take up your accessible tool and remind people in this like ableist dominant society that everyone doesn't have the high functioning capacity that you might have. And like, this is a signifier of that. And maybe you should pay closer attention before you push me out the door and step over me to get where you want to go, right? And so you know, Hannah was really skillful in using the mat in that scene to sort of mirror my visual limitations in terms of not being able to see the periphery and just like, you know, the camera movement within that scene. So those are like a couple of examples, but, you know, there are other things that we did where we would, you know, I will say like something that disastrous happened was an award that I won at Sundance fell off of a high shelf in my apartment and just like cracked into 3 different pieces. And you know, I knew it couldn't be replaced, and Kirsten Rossi, the DP, was like, "Can I borrow that?" And I was like, "Sure, yeah, of course." And so she used it to shoot through it and to refract light with these like macro lenses, and to build this whole kind of abstract language with light and the granite of the rock. And so that was layered over Kayla's discussion of a time when she completely lost her vision and was just navigating the city through a kind of sense memory. So we were trying to kind of put the audience within that position. So those are some examples of that in vision portraits.
That's a great story.
It's fantastic. Yeah, Arseli just put in the chat, the beauty of broken awards. Never has a Sundance award been put to better use.
I want to go to Jenny and Lawrence for a second, because there was an earlier comment in the chat asking for you to give people a sense of what what Dwoskin's films are like and what they're about. And we've heard a bit about Rodney's work and about Code of the Freaks, but I think for people who don't know Dwoskin's work, and that's probably most of the people here, it would be helpful just briefly to characterize that work for folks, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I always quake in my boots slightly when I'm asked this question, because you know, the difficulty for me is that he started making films in 1964, I think, and he made films throughout his entire life until 2012. So I think it helps to think about sort of periods of filmmaking in his life and periods of approaches, rather than being able to describe this is what a Dwoskin film is like. But what I can say is that he's probably best known for his work in the 1960s and 1970s, which was kind of featured as part of underground filmmaking. So if you think about the fact that in the 60s he was in New York. There's an amazing photograph of him in the archive with Andy Warhol. He knew Yvonne Reiner. He was working, making films alongside Jonas Mekas. And the reason why he was part of the establishment of the London Filmmakers Co-op in London was because he was basing it on the New York Filmmakers Co-op. So, and that then became the Lux, which is the organization that now distributes his films. So if you're thinking about underground, you're also thinking about films that are very intimate, very close up, vulnerable, quite difficult to watch sometimes, especially because they engage with female sexuality. And Dwoskin found himself in the midst of quite a few really robust discussions from feminists. So some feminists were very supportive of his filmmaking, and they could identify that the vulnerability that he was exploring wasn't about the typical able-bodied white masculine gaze, but was actually about sitting alongside, sitting with people in extreme forms of vulnerability and confinement. And there's something about confinement, about very, very close up, intimate images where there's a lot of blur. You might not even be able to identify what body part you're looking at. That's a really core feature of his work that kind of runs from the early work in the 60s right through to the personal filmmaking that he was making with an iPad, with phones, with digital filmmaking in the 2000s and 2012s. And so it's really hard for me to describe what a Dwoskin film is like, but I think what you're likely to find is confrontation, discomfort, beauty, observations of nature. What else are you likely to find? Mythology, particularly Jewish mythology. He was a member of the Jewish diaspora. Intimate portraits of family as well. I think he had a really deep awareness of his connectedness and closeness to his family. And an investment in really deep investment in vulnerability. I think that's kind of what I would describe as a Dwoskin film. And I've made a few recommendations in the response to the Q&A for films that you might like to think about or look at. And I'd love to continue the conversation about how we could bring a program to the States of his work. There was at Metrograph in New York earlier this year, and also at the E-Flux screening room. So I'd love to open up that conversation.
Yeah, Lawrence?
Yeah, I echo those sentiments. I think if somebody were to ask me to describe Dwoskin's film, at least the what I've been able to screen and see thus far, I would say those through lines are definitely vulnerability and confinement throughout the course of his career. I would also I'd have to ask which Dwoskin at what time too, to kind of differentiate between those different stages and those periods of his work. One of the reasons that I titled the piece that Jenny so kindly mentioned before, the manifesto, Where Have You Gone, Stephen Dwoskin, sort of echoing Simon and Garfunkel as well, which was on purpose, because at that point, films about disability, at least mainstream films, commercial films about disability, had always been sappy, safe, and sentimental. And Dwoskin was none of those things. And so that was sort of a pushback for me to say, when are we going to see more of the complexity of what my experience of disability has been? And thankfully, since that was published in 2019, whether it's Code of the Freaks or Rodney's films or many of the things that are in the dossier, many of those filmmakers and people that are creating works that are much more nuanced and complex have been brought to light and are gaining audiences, which is wonderful to see in just a short period of time.
Great. There's a lot of thanks coming in the chat for, especially I want to mention for the ASL interpreters and for Joshua Edwards on CART captioning. There's a comment. I'm going to move into starting to take up some of your questions and comments along with discussing amongst ourselves. So I want to bring one to the panel. David Edelman posted. He's wondering about the relationship between Code of the Freaks and Norden's Cinema of Isolation, if any, that text is often positioned as an origin point for disability film history. So do any of you want to comment on that?
This is Carrie. I can comment briefly. Cinema of Isolation by Martin Norden was, I think, published in the mid-90s, maybe 1994. And it was like a lifeline to me. really informed a lot of my thinking about theater and film and disability. And the book is like one of the, I think the first, correct me if I'm wrong, Lawrence probably knows, book-length studies of disability in cinema and the history of these representations, focuses on physical disability. But I think that it's informed the project in really significant ways. I mean, if you go to our website, codeofthefreaks.com, we have a curriculum and there are study guides that have a lot of bibliographical references of scholarship that influenced our work as well, if you're interested, in the resource section.
Great. Salome, did you want to add anything, or anyone else for that matter?
Yeah, I would just say that yeah, I mean, it was one of those first books that was readily available, one of those things that you could actually purchase and find and you know, sort of dive into the themes and the ideas that Norden kind of approaches. I came at this, I think, a little bit later, so I was also able to take advantage of the internet and some of Paul Longmore's work and the work of my colleague Chris Mitt, who unfortunately just passed away, but edited a book called Screening Disability, which kind of went into it more from the insider perspective, right? So as a disabled person. So again, those critiques, I think, are really foundational in terms of where we all began, but have continued to evolve and deepen with the addition of insider perspectives, first-person disability perspectives that broaden and enrich the critique.
Can I also put a shout out for David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder's?
Sorry, do you want to just introduce yourself first, Jenny?
Oh, sorry. This
Just
is
say your
Jenny.
name. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry to just interject there. Yeah, I just wanted to give an additional shout out for David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder's narrative prosthesis.
Absolutely, yeah.
Amazing peak of cinema actually is so very much dependent upon representations of disability as the central structure for the way that it makes stories, the way that it tells stories. That was a really profound moment for me in my journey through disability film history and disability film theory.
This is Carrie, and also real quick, the class that I teach at UIC, Disability in American Film, I inherited from Sharon Snyder. And David and Sharon's work was, and continues to be very important to any of these discussions.
Great.
In the spirit of, this is Salome, in the spirit of the moment, I'll throw a quick shout out. Thanks to Carrie and Ali Pat Savis, our other co-producer, on the Code of the Freaks website. In addition to the resources, there's like several teaching units based on the film and it's all free.
Great. And I just wanted to remind people about Arseli's new book, Activist Affordances. And so, don't forget that either. So the publishing continues. I want to go back and begin to take more of the questions. Feel free to post them into the Q&A. James DeVille asks, what about the soundtracks to these films? Do you want to comment on that? I think that's a very pertinent point. Anyone want to address that?
I will say on Vision Portrait.
This is Rodney.
This is Rodney speaking. And on Vision Portraits, I worked with a really, really talented sound designer named Abigail Savage, whose work I saw in a documentary called Bronx Gothic. And I loved her use of environmental sounds and yeah, the environment as score almost, and the ways that she could kind of meld that into a kind of soundscape that that was abstractive, that wasn't telling people how to think or feel, and that wasn't manipulative, but that was something else. There was another layer, another texture that that she brought to the film, and I specifically sought her out because of her work on Bronx, in the film Bronx Gothic. Yeah, so, and then of course I collaborated very, very closely with Erin DeWard, who did the audio description for Vision Portraits, which was a very important part of making the film, because I hadn't done audio description before. And just a shout out to Georgina Klieg. I went to a talk that Georgina did at NYU, where she really showed some bad moments of audio description. And, you know, there were a lot of people that I would talk to about making the film. I would go to verbal description tours, like at the Whitney or whatever, and I'd just talk to people, and they'd be like, whatever you do, don't want to do any one of those god-awful audio description tracks. They're just so monotonous and cold and droning, and just don't do it. And so I remember just meekly raising my hand at Georgina's talk and asking if she had any advice to a filmmaker that was in post-production about how to make an audio description track that didn't suck.
I love that. I love that. This is Ruby. I just wanted to remind people that this is the second of 2 webinars. And in the first one, we had Pooja Rangan and Jordan Lord talking a lot about audio description. So if you go on the website, you can find that. Sorry, Arseli, I see that you have your hand up, and Jenny after you. So let me cede the floor.
Hi, this is Arseli speaking. Thank you so much. This is such a wonderful discussion. I'm really enjoying every moment of it, and I always say we have more time. About the access features, absolutely. I think what Georgina Klieg wrote in the chat is important. The beauty of learning about things, how to make things accessible, is that now we learn it, we can't let it go. And I also want to say something about, as someone teaching in a university, there will be people looking at this webinar and reading these issues. Please include these works as core curriculum materials in your teaching resources. Don't make disability just a special week issue. This should be core curriculum in film studies, communication, media, theater, and fine arts, and etc., so that people don't have to reach situations such as what Carrie has been through and writing about in Tyranny of the Neutral. We need the pedagogies to be drastically changed from a critical disability studies perspective, and that's incumbent on us, everyone as a teacher watching this, to do that. I also wanted to say how a couple of comments that will all come in a bundle. Apologies about that. I will try to be slow. One thing that I really appreciate about disability arts and cultures is its richness. And then, as Faye was saying, community is not one single thing. There are so many other different opinions, sometimes in tension, sometimes in different directions. When I thought about Rodney's work and Rodney's film, and if I could pick one adjective to describe it, will be gentle. How gentle everything was in that film, despite all the anger you have. Like, you're waiting till that moment to say, I'm disabled, to shot, which I wish you did so long before. So, and your images are so gentle, like almost dancing with each other when you're putting those moments together. And the ambiguities you portray as people go into blindness, you know, it's not a straightforward road. We don't end up being, hey, disability pride, you know. sometimes there's lots of loss and sadness. And as Alison Kafer writes, we might not want to become more disabled. And that should be also part of the disability politics, which your work, especially when you're talking to Kayla, is so beautifully portraying. And I was so happy to see those stories, seeing the vulnerable side of disability, the sadness and about loss, being ambiguous about it, and being maybe not being able to be so forthcoming about it. So all these are parts of the disability politics and different types of representation when we think of it, like pairing it with the work of like, which is also wonderful, coming from a different perspective, the Code of Freak style. So which like all of them are part of the richness of disability cultures. And I just wanted to also mention a big shout out, since we are talking about accessibility and audio description, to Shirley Green, whom I'm learning a lot about audio descriptions, developing choreographic approaches to audio description. Big shout out to Thomas Reed and Read My Mind podcast. He's great in bringing together different approaches to audio description. Also,
Arseli, I apologize for cutting you off, but if I don't, we won't get to the
Sure.
rest of the panelists before we.
absolutely, my apologies.
Sorry,
I'm
not
just,
at all.
Just cutting off here.
I love that. I love it, but I see all their other hands up and I want to make sure we don't run out of time. And if we have time, I'll come back to you. Jenny and then Salome and then Lawrence. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can I just ask if you can hear me a little better? I understand that the mic had gone very
Yes,
low.
yes,
before.
very good.
That's good to hear. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to respond to a few of the comments. So one was the question about sound and voice, or two separate questions about sound and about voice. And I just, I've given both of their names in the chat, but I just wanted to identify that Stephen Dwoskin collaborated quite extensively with sound composers, especially avant-garde sound composers, like, for instance, Gavin Bryars, Gavinbryars, and Ron Geesin, Rongeeesin. And so this is in the 60s and 70s, and the soundscapes that were created, they have their own quality of intimacy. And it's really interesting that part of what I was tapping into, particularly as Arseli was talking, is a kind of embodied intimacy, a proximity to embodied practice that has some, and which can be gentle and intimate, and also can be powerfully rage filled. And I think that becomes apparent in some of the sound compositions in some of Dwoskin's films. I also just, well, as we're moving towards thinking about creative audio description, I wanted to give a shout out to some of the people in the UK who've been thinking and reflecting on this. An early career artist called Leah Clements has been doing really interesting work with breast, with photography and audio description. And I also just wanted to, I know that we were talking about audio description rather than captioning, but Sharon Finnegan and Louise Hickman's work on creative access practices, which has also been distributed through the Lux in London. And I know that this tapped into part of the conversation a few weeks ago in the first part, but I love the creative potential of reflecting on access, on audio description and captioning as maybe even a form of expanded cinema, expanded digital cinema. Which is enriching in how we think about cinema as multidimensional. Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a little at the moment.
Thanks, Jenny. That's great. And I see Salome nodding. So Salome, I'm going to go to you.
Yeah, so I'll very briefly respond to the soundtrack question, which is that, so as mentioned earlier, Code of the Freaks uses over 100 clips from film history from across the previous century into this one. And we felt that using the sound in those clips was as well extremely important to the environment that we were creating. So we have both, clips running sync sound, but also in the background of interviews. So it's putting together the film was a huge challenge in terms of audio description and even in terms of getting in original music, because between the dialogue and the diegetic music, there just was no space on the track, and we had really hoped to be a lot more creative with audio description than we were able to be at the end. But and then we did have some original drumming by Brad Newton taking us in and out of the film. But otherwise, our audio was kind of, I guess, colonized from the original films.
Very good. Thank you. Lawrence, you were waiting patiently.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point. Jenny and I couldn't get into it during our conversation, but I want to plant a seed here and something for folks to think about. One of the questions was, why is the archive, the Dwoskin archive, so important to sustaining activist practices in film? I would also want to extend that to talk about the artists and the development of artistry and creativity. You know, when I did the Turner Classic Movies Project initially, I looked at 237 films to decide on 20 we could showcase, right? And probably 20% of what I screened was in the Warner Brothers archive, had never been released on DVD, was not commercially available, had been forgotten since it was first released in 1948 or whenever. And so we're at a stage now where if I get hit by a bus, I'm wondering what's going to happen to my archive, what's going to happen to everything that I've collected through the years. And I'd like us to think, both as activists and scholars and archivists, et cetera, how we collect these works so that they'll be available for future generations and people currently. Thanks.
Beautiful. Thanks, Lawrence. There's a question in the chat from Bill Kirkpatrick saying, especially for Code of the Freaks folks, following up on the question of sound, what did you learn about the, quote, disabled voice, quote, and watching so many films and how disability is expressed sonically? But I would say from that, maybe in terms of how you responded also, what did you learn? We have just very little bit of time left, but I wonder if anybody wants to respond to this around this question of the disabled voice. I think it could be applicable to all of you if anyone has any thoughts to share.
Well, I mean, I can, this is Carrie. I think we found that the disabled voice is not in Hollywood. You have to dig and find, and but definitely is starting to flourish more and more in independent film and other forms of medium. I also wanted to say something about the audio description issue, and it's kind of a form of accountability, and something that I want to raise for all of us to think about is how we may have failed. Salome talked about how we didn't leave a lot of space for audio description. It was our intention. We even had some funding, but we couldn't make it happen to make a separate audio described version in which the action would pause and descriptions could, there could be descriptions and then the movie could resume or people could stop and play. And then also our film is very sensory dense. You know, we do have the clips running behind the interviews, and there's a lot of fast moving images, and we wanted to make, and I think we still plan to, it's a 15-year project now, a sensory, one that's more sensory friendly, I guess, where we wanted to take out the images that ran behind people and just have the green screen, so that people that, I mean, I have autistic friends, for instance, who say they can't watch the movie. So for any budding filmmakers out there or disabled folks to be thinking about those access things as you're putting your work together, instead of like at the end and like then having to create, oh, now we want this version of the movie and that version, and then, you know, things can fall by the wayside.
Okay, we have less than 5 minutes left. Rodney, did you want to add something?
Yeah. First, I wanted to echo that idea of leaving space for audio description, and you know, if your film is you know, has tons of interviews or a lot of verite scenes, and there's just no space on the soundtrack. Like, I'm the type of filmmaker that likes to let moments breathe and likes to have verite moments play out, and has montage moments to have the viewer absorb information. Like, I think that was helpful for for Erin to be able to do her job, because she needed, you know, to fit her description in a certain amount of space where she wasn't stepping on other things like interviews and things like that. But what I really wanted to talk about was at the end of Code of the Freaks, because I just watched it last night, and it resonated so powerfully for me, was you know, people talking about the idea of what they wanted to see, right? And that the idea of like two Crips like having sex, right? Like, or a Crip spy who like hides things in her wheelchair, and you know, just the and it feels like, you know, you're not going to get that from like the mainstream. You're going to get it from you know, independence, and it, Riva Lira, I remember talking about just like a real true kind of vulnerability, which it sounds like Dwoskin really embodies a lot of within his work. So it feels like some of it might be there, but you have to kind of dig for it. And so yeah, I'm just thinking about what people voiced as things they wanted to see that hadn't been shown before, you know, future possibilities and potentials.
Thanks so much for that, Rodney. We sadly have a hard out, so we can't just keep unwinding this. I have a feeling we could go on for another hour or more if we had the time, but I wanted to end with the comment from Georgina Klieg, who says, a challenge. She says, a question for Film Quarterly. Now that you've learned how to make an accessible open source format, will you continue to do this for future issues? People with print disabilities are interested in film, not only that which is about disability. So I appreciate that challenge. We are changing websites, and we're hopeful that the new updated website will make it easier to make it accessible. I would say, you know, stay tuned. And we accept that as a reasonable question. You've all been wonderful. This has been a fantastic session. I especially want to thank Faye and Lawrence for co-editing this dossier. Without them, this would not exist, and you all wouldn't be here. It's been a really important experience, and I appreciate the attendance today and everyone's input. And this is the start. This better not be the end of Film Quarterly dealing with questions of disability. So feel free to come to us with submissions and ideas in the future. And on that note, go forth and multiply disability studies and make more films. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.